Hi, I'm Femi Okay.
I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, we speak with Native American activists to explore why mascots based on indigenous symbols persist and how anti-racism activists are advocating for change.
The stream, of course, is driven by you, our community, and today's show was pitched to us on Twitter by John Little, who we'll be hearing from in just a moment. But first, check out the trailer for his 2017 documentary film, More Than a Word, narrated by Native American musician and former stream guest, Frank Walm.
Labeled in many dictionaries as a noun, dated or offensive, and simply defined an American Indian.
Every so often, the press discovers Native peoples.
A protest in North Dakota against a major oil pipeline continues to grow.
How is it that they're able to proceed in the way they have? They believe their own racist stereotypes about Native people.
It was never intended to be racist. 20 years ago, you didn't hear about any of this.
But we're still considered these kind of like headdress caricatures living on the plains and, never went past 1900. That doesn't really allow us into like this, modern dialogue where we have all these issues that are happening.
From the Washington Redskins to the Cleveland Indians, many sport teams and academic institutions in the United States use mascots based on indigenous stereotypes. For years, Native American and anti-racism activists have pushed for change using the hashtag #NotYourMascot to denounce racist portrayals of the community.
Still, hundreds of organizations, both educational and athletic, continue to reference, objectify, or caricature Native American traditions. Activists say a double standard exists, one that quickly condemns racism towards other minority groups while allowing indigenous stereotypes and slurs to go unchallenged, both on the field and in the public consciousness.
Joining us now to talk about all of this in the U.S. state of Oregon, Jacqueline Keeler is a journalist and author who co-founded the group Eradicating Offensive Native Mascotry. In Colorado, Michael Roberts is the president and CEO of the First Nations Development Institute and also co-founder of the group Reclaiming Native Truth, which works to dispel misconceptions about Native communities. And in Minnesota, John Little, whose tweets you saw at the very beginning of the program, is director of the film More Than a Word and also a PhD student at the University of Minnesota. It's good to have you all here. So much to talk about. Malika, you start.
Indeed. So I want to start with a poignant story from a member of our community, Francis Danger, about why we're talking about this today. Francis writes in, I support #NotYourMascot because my daughter was told that racism against Native Americans doesn't matter, and the Washington football team name was one of the reasons cited. She goes on to say, in a separate incident, my daughter was called a name, retarded Redskin, and seeing and even saying that for me personally is difficult, as I'm sure for many in our audience. But Francis goes on to say that she has a right not to have a racial slur be thrown in her face by anyone, much less a world famous organization like the National Football League. I want to give this one to you, John, this little anecdote here from Francis. Thinking of it, is this what propelled you to pitch today's show and why you wanted to talk about this?
Yeah, I think one of the incidents was what we saw a few weeks ago in D.C. with the students from Covington. And I think I saw those boys in there, whoever started it, that's what the debate kind of ended up turning into, who started it or who was yelling what. But you saw those boys doing the tomahawk chop to a Native elder because that's what they've been seeing. That's what they've seen their whole life is stereotypes and Native mascots. And so one of the reasons that we made the film was to kind of challenge those narratives. And I think it was just something that we really wanted to do, but I saw that conversation, and then in the NFL, the Super Bowl is on Sunday. We almost had an NFL or a Chiefs team that would have been in there as well, and we would have seen that tomahawk chop again on Sunday. And so I think that was kind of one of the reasons I pitched the conversation is it's another year the NFL is ending, and we're still having to deal with these. And so I hope that we can really kind of push those things and think about, changing not only the Redskins, but also the Kansas City Chiefs team as well.
Jacqueline, I just want to remind people what they were just looking at then. It was January the 18th. There were two competing marches happening in Washington, D.C. One was a pro-life march, one was the Indigenous Peoples March. And some young lads were gathered around a very well-known Native American activist called Nathan Phillips. And I want you to hear the sound, because I want to know how you feel when you hear this sound. Let's play that clip. Now, Jacqueline, for people who haven't gone to sports games in the US, any of the American teams, the sports teams, or the college teams that have Native American mascotry, they will have tomahawk chops, they will have songs like that or sounds like that. That is pretty typical. When you hear that, how do you feel?
Yeah, I think this is why I coined the term mascotry, because I feel the problem is not the mascot necessarily, which can be a very prosaic warrior, handsome man type of thing, but it's what they do with it. The things that the practices that they do with the tomahawk chops and the stereotypes it promotes. I think that is the biggest problem. Mascotry is a combination of two words, mascots, and then also revelry, kind of giving you a sense of sort of like Rio, a carnival sort of atmosphere where the normal social rules are lifted. And that's not a place you want your own traditions to be in. And so I think that mascotry is the real problem. And I don't think that as long as we are only known as mascots, and there really aren't very many other portrayals of Native Americans in the media, and there's no TV shows featuring modern Native families. I think that the Reclaiming Native Truth found that Americans know very little about Native Americans, and so mascots, I always say, mask our realities, our real lived realities, and replace them with these stereotypical images, and make it very difficult. Studies have shown that mascots not only propagate stereotypes, but they propagate primarily negative stereotypes.
Jacqueline, there's a tweet here of someone who I think would agree almost completely with what you were saying there. This person writes in that mascots contribute to our perception as atemporal people. We're depicted as people in the past, and it neutralizes the ability for non-natives to recognize our modern battles. They like the idea of us, but not of having to deal with our reality. So it's on that note, the erasure note, that we got a video comment from someone in the community, Douglas Miles of Arizona, who talks about that same issue. Have a listen.
Native American mascots were created by American corporations to sell tales of Native American pain. By creating Native American mascots, they've created a way to dehumanize Native American people. Native American people are complex human beings. By turning us into a symbol to make money with, they not only dehumanize us, they demean us and exploit Native American imagery. No matter what anyone says, Native American mascots are very harmful and disrespectful to Native people.
So Michael, that's his take on why these images were created in the first place. What's yours?
No, I mean, I would wholeheartedly agree with both what Jacqueline said and what the video caller said as well. I mean, I think a lot of the work that we have done with Reclaiming Native Truth was really trying to understand the base narratives that American people thought about when they thought about Indians, because our belief was that we could not reclaim the narrative or create a new narrative for Natives if we didn't understand what that base narrative was. And so we did a lot of research looking at how people viewed Indians. We did focus groups, national surveys, and I think one of the biggest findings we had was more of a verification that, for the most part, Indians are invisible in our society. In fact, there was a Native artist in one of our focus groups who said, the power of invisibility is a superpower we wish we didn't have.
John,
go ahead,
John.
I think that's a great point. I think sometimes you just also have to look at the system that we're living in. So we're living in a system, it's a settler colonial system. That's what America is. And I think when you break these down, there's all sorts of factors that I think Douglas and everybody else has kind of touched on a little bit. But for the most part, it's really about power. It's about controlling identity. Because if you can control Native identity, then you don't have to acknowledge that there were people here before Americans came or before Europeans came. So on one hand, it's about power and kind of just dispelling the notion that Native people were murdered here. And then on the other hand, it's also another factor is about white guilt. People don't want to acknowledge that genocide that happened. And so I think that's two very large reasons, but there's a lot of other factors that people have touched on too.
John, I want to play.
Yeah, I think that.
Go ahead.
Okay, I think that a lot of people try to compare it to the Vikings, and I often say that would only be comparable if the only way you ever saw white men was as a Viking. I mean, nothing else. You never saw them on television, in a TV show. You never saw them saving the world in a Hollywood movie. You never saw them as president of the United States. You only ever saw a white man as a Viking. And what would be the first thing you'd say when you met him, which would be, "Where's your longboat? Where are your horns?" This is exactly the situation we are actually in. I live in Portland, Oregon, and when I go into Powell's bookstore, there are, out of all the books in the bookstore, there are probably 5 books written from someone from my perspective, a Native woman in the 21st century. And that this is our reality. Imagine if that was, the reality of white men. It would be a very different world. And so it's really the absence of any other portrayals and the lack of balance. I mean, there are allegedly over 2,000 high schools with Native mascots. If there were that many, the Black community is about 10 times the size of the Native community. If there were that many, high schools with Black mascots, that would be 20,000 high schools. Imagine how the kind of stereotypes that would propagate and lend itself to, and the sort of mascotry, and how much more of a burden that would be to the Black community, to Black students, to Black families, to have to educate over that. And you have to realize that most Native youth don't live on the reservation. They don't go to schools where they're the majority. They go to schools where they're often the only Indian kid. And so you can't put it on them to have to educate against this really endemic system of misinformation.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, and I would argue even at the high schools and the schools where Indians are the majority, the textbooks they're using are outdated textbooks that rarely show Indians in contemporary society. I think John said it best when we talked about American Indians are America's first inconvenient truth and maybe our lasting inconvenient truth, that the treatment of American Indians by the United States really flies in the face of American exceptionalism.
Guess I just want to play a little clip from John's documentary, More Than a Word, because there are fans who enjoy doing tomahawk chops, who enjoy dressing up as Native American Indians, and they have no issue with that, and they don't even think it's racist. Have a listen to this.
I think that we as Redskin fans mean anything deplorable about the American Indian nation. I think it's a good thing.
The name is not intended to be derogatory in any way. It's a thing of pride, an idea of pride that we have in the team.
Actually, it should be an honor, because they are honoring the American Indian name, and it's not anything derogatory against against the American Indians. The Redskins used to be a good thing.
You can see that they're a little bit confused there, John. Were you standing there in front of the camera? Were you making them feel awkward as they were trying to justify how they felt or explain how they felt even?
Yeah, I don't look like what people think a Native American should look like. And so
breaking the stereotype right there, John.
So I don't think they had any idea that me and my brother were Native. Like, that never crossed their minds that a Native person would be interviewing them about that. But I mean, just kind of on, it was tough to listen to people say all those things and not even think about Native people. And you can also hear their discomfort. The one guy also clearly defended the name, but knew enough to not call.
He stumbled on. He wasn't even sure that he could say the word.
Right. So he knows that you can't say that to a contemporary group of Native people, but so it was just interesting to interview those fans, but it's also very shocking to see that they had no idea that we were Native. And I understand that. I mean, like, we don't look like, I'm not wearing a headdress or, a lot of other stereotypes that I think people want to believe in.
Yeah, Yeah, Malika.
So I wanted to bring up this, along those same lines, I wanted to bring up this interesting idea here from someone on Twitter. They said, I believe the Chicago Blackhawks work with local tribes to make sure that they are respectable, and the Blackhawks being the hockey team, my hometown. And someone else writes in an example that they want to give. This is Robert, who says, Washington's NFL mascot is an example of what not to do. Seattle's NFL, National Football League team, uses native imagery inspired by a Northwest Coast mask. Native representation in sports can and should be better. So these examples here, Michael, either the Blackhawks working with Native communities, using imagery in a slightly more representative fashion, as some say some teams are doing. What's your take on that?
Well, you know, I've had this conversation with my Seahawk fan friends. I mean, I don't think cultural appropriation is good or any better than the mascotry that Jacqueline talks about. You know, I think, you know, we found in our research that, you know, there are a lot of things that folks are sympathetic with Indians about. Mascots is not one of them. 39% of people oppose the mascots in our research, and about 59% don't oppose it at all. But what's interesting is when we went to the focus groups and asked people if they would call an American Indian a Redskin to their face, 8 out of 10 people said they would not. So there must be some baseline of understanding that this is really a racist and offensive term.
Can you explain, because we were having this discussion amongst ourselves before we started to do this show about, can we say the word Redskin? Is it a noun? How offensive would it be if we kept on repeating the word? Should we just talk about the Washington football team? Can you help our general audience understand what that word means if you're Native American?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things, like one of our logos we had, and I have it in a T-shirt, is from an 1862 or so article in the Winona Daily Republic in Minnesota.
John, we've just lost John there for a moment. We will reconnect. While we reconnect, I want to show you this book here on my laptop, Mascot Nation. It is about the controversy over Native American representation in sports. One of the authors or co-authors is Andrew Billings. We spoke to Andrew in the last 24 hours and asked him, why is it that these mascots still remain in US sport? This is what he told us.
To tell someone that a certain mascot name or ritual that you've done with your grandparents for decades is racist, insensitive, or offensive in some way is implying that they were learning the improper lessons from generations before them. And so they see it as an affront to their family that has embraced a team sometimes for many, many decades. And they have a hard time with any notion of what we've been doing is wrong and we have to rethink what we've been doing for that long a time.
So rethinking what you've been doing wrong.
Yeah.
Baby steps. I'll go to you with this, Jacqueline. 2 examples I want to give you. First one is from Brett on Twitter, who says, I got a large high school in Chicago to remove an offensive mascot last year. Due to ignorance, I believe these folks truly do believe that it is an honor, despite the fact it trades on stereotypical images to serve as entertainment. And I hope that a bill in Maine that's being considered right now is successful. Another example is in the form of a video comment I'd like to share with you. Someone who worked for many years on a campaign to change the name of the Washington football team, Amanda Blackhorse. She spoke to us about that fight.
I was a part of litigation against the Washington NFL team for about 11 years. While our case, Blackhorse et al. Versus Pro Football, is no longer in effect right now, one of the greatest victories that came out of our case was in 2015 when a federal judge, ruled that the R word is offensive. You don't need to go very far to find that information. You don't need to look very far to see other points of reference that say that the term is offensive. Look it up in the dictionary. It's right there.
So Jacqueline, she sees that as a win, though of course an appeals court vacated that decision in 2018. You can see that headline here, but still some communities are saying the fact that a judge ruled that it was offensive is a win.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The issue with that case has to do with the kind of law they were citing, which is pretty controversial in itself, because it deals with free speech and civil rights, and can be used against minority groups as well. But as far as this idea of this sort of history attached to mascotry, I think that I would point to a study done by Emory University in 2015, which found that actually mascots cost teams money. Native mascots do. They did a study of college and university teams that had given up native mascots because there's a large cohort of them that have. And what they found was that over a 2-year period, the actual amount of audience participation increased. So from that, they surmised that actually having a native mascot was actually off-putting to the audience, more than people realize. There is actually a cost to that. And they did estimates in both for the Washington NFL team and also for the Cleveland MLB team. And they found that for the Cleveland team in particular was a very high cost. They were estimating $1.8 million a season they were losing. So people may feel very attached to it, but in fact, it does alienate a lot of the audience, a substantial amount of the audience. And so when they do change to something else, they actually have a greater participation.
I don't feel we can have this conversation without mentioning Dan Snyder. Dan Snyder is the owner of the Washington Redskins. He has embraced this debate, but not in a way that you may imagine. He says here, and he said this many, many times, we will never change the name of the team. As a lifelong Redskins fan, and I think that the Redskins fans understand the great tradition, what it's all about, what it means. So we feel pretty fortunate to be just working on next season. We will never change the name. It's that simple. Never. You can use caps. You can use caps, Michael. What would you say back to him?
I think Redskin fans understand the tradition of winning, and Mr. Snyder hasn't done that for them either. I think it's a little misguided.
All right.
I think it's a little misguided. I think that is a man who is participating in the national bullying of a population, and he really doesn't care because he has the economic clout and the privilege that lets him do so.
Now that you are back, John, I wanted to bring this tweet to you where we got cut off just a little bit before. This is Tristan, who writes in that it is the 21st century and journalists are still trying to figure out if the use of derogatory mascots and dictionary-defined racial slurs in sports are racist. I have no sympathy for an industry that can't recognize racism and lacks the backbone to call it out. And of course, we were just talking about the Washington football team there and considering how to call it. It is a proper noun. Your take on that?
Yeah, I think I think that's one of the easiest ways is to get this to be changed would be to have sports reporters. And I think that trend started in 2013, 2014 and around there that people actually quit saying it and started saying the R word. Usually I say the R word. Sometimes when you have to say it, I'll say it. But I think we really need investment from journalists to do that. And I think journalists need to start reframing new conversations to have about Native people, because a lot of times they're just getting 1 or 2 clips from people and getting sound bites versus actually having Native perspectives on there. And so I think that's something that journalists need to also do, is to actually find credible Native people out there. There's a lot of really great people that have really great perspectives that can also go beyond mascots. And so I think that's something that journalists need to really work to do too.
John, we have your number.
I would add that if you look at newsrooms, you're not seeing a very large diversity in population in newsrooms and on editing floors. And so I think if you're waiting around for the news industry and the media industry to change, you're going to have to change the composition of people.
Oh, it's about representation. John and Jacqueline and Michael, thank you so much at the end of this show. But as John challenged us, many more topics to talk about, and we always do that on the stream. As far as Native American communities are concerned, Malika?
America, your rent is overdue would add, make sure we include those Native voices in those conversations.
Thank you, guests. Thank you, viewers, for following us at AUJ Stream. We're always on Twitter, always online. See you next time.